Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs. Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and we've got another great episode with a great guest lined up for today. Today's guest is the Director of Change Management Lead for Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Please welcome to the show, Sean McCarthy. Hello, Sean.
Hey, Justin. Great to be on the show. Thanks so much.
Really looking forward to the discussion. We had a great prep call and looking forward to sharing some of your insights with the audience. So I want to start this podcast the way we start every podcast and ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the deskless or frontline workforce today?
Oh, the deskless workforce. Yeah, that's a tough one because there's so many competing interests. And I think the biggest one is getting back to work-life balance. That was pretty easy when you had an office to go to and separating your work life from your home life. Now they're going to be ever more intertwined. And that's going to be a struggle for everyone because let's face it, we all deal with distractions, some of us better than others. But that being said, you want to be productive and you want to also serve your home life, but how do you keep those compartmentalized? And that's going to be a struggle, I think. And, that's about trust.
Yeah. In the organizations that you're working around today, do you feel like things are back to pre-COVID normal, or are we still in a transition state?
I would say there's no such thing as getting back to pre-COVID normal. That turned everything on its head in a good way and a bad way. I mean, obviously, the COVID was a tragedy in itself, but the innovations that have come from that in helping to accelerate technologies that have been available for over a decade now, but really permeating the entire workspace at this point has really accelerated the distributed workforce. And I'd say that's a blessing in a lot of ways, but boy, are we struggling to deal with it. That's true for any really transformational sort of leap.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are probably some things that we can come back to when we get into it. Before we go any further down the path, though, why don't we let our audience hear a little bit about you and your background and what you've been up to, what's led you to where you're at today, and what you're doing today.
Yeah, that's kind of a circuitous route. Originally, I went to college at the U.S. Naval Academy and did 20 years as a naval officer flying maritime patrol aircraft. And then retired a few years ago and decided I needed to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. Got into management consulting, and that led to a change management role with a large defense contractor, and then eventually moving on to Takeda Pharmaceuticals, where I'm happy to say I found a home.
How many retired pilots from the military end up as change management professionals? Like, is there some percentage? How close to zero is it?
I would say I'm the only one I know of, but that doesn't mean there aren't any others out there. And if you're out there, amen, brother, or sister. Yeah. Glad to have you in the space.
Is there anything that from your background that prepared you for or made you interested to pursue change management as a profession?
Well, it's funny. I would say it's a serendipity that I fell into this role because it was all because of another veteran who said at a job fair when I was coming out, said, "Hey, you'd be good at that." And I said, "Cool. What is it and why?" Because I had no idea that this is a role. We certainly don't have change implementation folks in the military because everybody's expected to implement change. And in fact, that's what you're brought up to just think about all the time, because the battle space is always changing. You're always flexing to it. You don't have time to say, hey, I need to come up with a plan again when you're moving on to the next objective. So you I would say, was it Eisenhower, I think, that said, planning is essential, but plans are worthless. So, we plan, so we kind of get ready for it, but then you flex. And I think just being used to flexing made it a natural transition. And I think it helps with helping other people manage change. Because let's face it, we all kind of freak out when things get turned sideways. But it's generally good to have somebody that's been there and done that and lived with it to kind of help, walk you through it.
So I admit to my naivete in military. I've never spent any time in the military, and have a few friends and acquaintances that I've talked to and listened to stories, but I've never really heard anybody talk about it the way that you just described it. And that's kind of fascinating. And you're making me want to divert for just a few minutes and explore really what I feel like I heard you say is that change management is an integral part of being in the military, which makes perfect sense. And the way that you described it makes perfect sense. Preparedness for anything and a nimbleness. You talked about flexing, always changing. I love that. Why is it that it seems so obtuse to the way we kind of naturally run things in the civilian side of things? Because we really need that same flexibility too. But it seems like this change management role, as you described, like you didn't even know it was a role. We're trying to evolve to that. Why does it seem like we're like pushing a rope so much?
Well, on a good day, hopefully nobody's shooting at you.
That's a good point.
So that is
So
generally
far,
a
I'm
pretty
zero.
good imperative for changing your point of view. But aside from that, I think this in the civilian sector, there's less disruption and it doesn't happen quite as quickly. Now that's changing, but I think what you'll find is, and you see this to a large extent in the military, they say we always fight the last war. Well, in the business, you're always fixing the last problem, and I think we both fall into that trap where you say, this has worked for decades. I've built my business on this successful paradigm. Why would I change that?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes the marketplace says you have to. You're eroding your competitive advantage. That's the same in the military. Sometimes it just happens faster because you're getting shot at. Okay, that's fine. We accelerate that timeline there, and it causes you to iterate faster. There's no better case for change than your business is about to fall apart, right? Everybody starts reaching for changes in their business when they see they're losing the marketplace, they're losing customers. But if you're successful, why would you change?
Yeah. Well, I have a suggestion for why. And it actually is, as I hear you talking about the, comparing and contrasting between the military and civilian organizations. I was at a presentation probably about a month ago where some military leaders were actually presenting to technology startups. And so I was in the technology startup part of the audience listening to what the military leaders are saying. Hey, this is what we need from the startup community. And there was an Army general and Navy admiral that had both presented at separate times. And I was fascinated by both of their discussions. And interestingly enough, you just reminded me about one of the points that was in common between them. They both talked about their excitement to hear about new technologies that they could leverage in their organizations and throughout the military. And they both talked about it like they would describe their excitement, enthusiasm, and starting to think about how they might implement these technologies. And then the moment that they thought about that, they also said, uh-oh, our competitors have this stuff too. Our adversaries have this too, right? And it was really kind of fascinating. And I left that conversation. I've said this to a few folks, like, I don't know how these guys ever sleep. Knowing what they know, I don't know how they get a night's sleep, because that perspective of saying, hey, we could harness this, and the enthusiasm that they demonstrated, but then how quickly that enthusiasm goes away when they say, holy crap, the other guys are going to have this too. Well, to bring that over, and I realize these are not the same thing. Okay. They're talking about hypersonic missiles being fired at our.
No. Actually, it's very similar.
But there's a competitive nature, right? When you are running a business, and there are always competitors. And if you think for a moment that there's not a competitor, then that's probably your most vulnerable moment, because somebody's going to come up and eat your lunch.
Somebody's always trying to eat your lunch.
Yeah, totally. Right. So, but it's interesting. I think you're also right in saying that we tend to want to feel comfortable in the predictability, like to get into the rut, and that's a comfortable place for us humans. And maybe we should adopt more of what you described from the beginning. It's like force to change. Hey, we need to plan, but the plans are worthless.
Yeah, that's right. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, but also no plan survives first contact with the marketplace.
Right.
Your customer is always going to tell you that that's pretty close to what I want, but that isn't exactly what I want.
Yeah.
And then inevitably you're going to get a great idea for how you can deliver it better. And sometimes that affects your frontline workforce where they say, hey, you've given me the best technology money can buy. One, I don't know how to use it. And two, it gets in the way of me delivering the product you wanted me to deliver, whether that be a service or some other product. And now you have a disconnect. And that's where I take that, your analogy with the military is you can have the best technology in the world. If you can't use it, or you can't use it as a community, as a business, and let's face it, that military, that team together is using that technology to not just use it as one person. It's the whole community's using it together to leverage to make everyone better. So like I said, if you've got a frontline worker that's just using the best technology, but doesn't get how it's connected to everything else, they're lost. They're not adding any additional value.
Yeah. One of our former podcast guests posted something great on LinkedIn today, and she said that she was describing the difference with technology adoption between usage and adoption, right? Usage is just getting people to actually like log in, but then adoption is actually integrating it into their workflows. I thought that was a good way to describe it. I think a lot of times major technology initiatives focus on just usage, kind of meeting the minimum requirement of usage. Did everybody log in? What kind of,
That's right. I'm using what I paid for.
Yeah. But that's not really where the ROI comes from. Those investments isn't truly integrating it in with those workflows and with those practices inside the business. And I think we struggle with that quite a bit. I'm curious to see, is that line up with what you're seeing when
Oh, absolutely.
programs?
Well, I mean, think about it this way. Let's say I'm introducing a series of applications that my workforce needs to use, but they're not connected, or they don't work together, or they're not easily aligned. Well, if I'm supposed to deliver some service and I've got to manage all these other applications, do you think I'm adding value to that worker's productivity? No, because I've taken somebody who's who's trained to provide a specific service, and now I've latched on, hey, you need to be the IT guru for these 5 applications, and you need to be your own tech support, because if you're in the field and you're disconnected, you're on your own, buddy. So that's where we start to go, okay, well, how can I use these technologies to be more productive, not just to gather more data? And I think that's where the fallacy of the data cult is, hey, if I only get more data, I can make better decisions. No, you got to use that data in a way that's not going to keep you from delivering the product that you were meant to deliver. That's what's making your money. That's what's keeping your business alive. Don't mess with that.
And what do you think? What do you think the solution is for that? Because I've had some observations, as I said to you earlier when we were just kicking off. I've had some observations in the field with clients of ours in my day job that I think it's not a lack of data that I think is the problem. I think it's that we've collected so much data, we've created so many dashboards, my company included, but I think people maybe a little have data fatigue. There's too much data, too many dashboards. And, people are like, yeah, but I got to get my freaking job done,
That's right.
How do we overcome that? Any advice on how we might want to look at that and maybe coach those users into making good use of that and still getting their job done?
Yeah, I think one of the things is backing up to when you're implementing. One of the things that I've done through a lot of tech implementations is user acceptance testing. And I think almost everybody's done a UAT at some point. And in some cases, it's a great opportunity to just pat yourself on the back and say, hey, we got this launched. Okay, cool. Let's just move on. It's also a point to take some hard data and a lot of anecdotal data and say, is this going to make things better or worse? And if you don't think that has an impact on your company's retention, think again. That's the unquantifiable little cloud that's going to hang over you if you implement something and everybody goes, this was awful. oh my goodness, I don't ever want to deal with this again. I'm actually going to go to another company where it's easier. They don't do it as fast, but hey, I don't have to deal with this nonsense. I've heard people say that, and in a UAT, you don't ever want to get to that point. You want to say, hey, I'm getting better data that I needed to make decisions, but I'm also making my employees more productive. And in a UAT, 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you, this is going to slow me down. And then, you may have to generate some sort of training. And let's face it, there's always an implementation hump that you got to get over. When we first started going from writing letters to sending emails, people didn't hardly knew how to turn on a computer. Now we don't even think about it.
Yep.
We don't even think about, smartphones haven't been around that long, but now we're instant messaging everybody and we expect that all the time, but there was a learning curve. Once you get through that learning curve, are you seeing that extra value? If you're not, maybe it's time to roll back. And I don't think anybody feels like, oh, well, I spent all this money on this thing, I need to roll this back because now I'm actually making things less productive. Sometimes you get it just bite the bullet and say, this was a bad idea. I think that rarely happens, but it does happen enough that you need to take a look at it after the fact and say, I've gotten over that learning hump and I've had the frontline workers give me feedback that says, this just isn't working as we intended. It's slowing me down.
Yeah. So I think you're spot on. And I think one of the things that I find frustrating that I still don't fully understand is why, when those moments are discovered in many large organizations, the project teams are forced to push through anyway, as if the implementation dates on the Gantt chart are more important than all of the other things that you just talk about. And I really don't get that. I don't know if maybe somebody up the food chain is got a bonus tied to this implementation.
Sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
If you ever read what is it, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, the heuristics, that the Nobel Prize winners Kahneman got, there's a lot of those that you kind of got to look at from a business leader perspective and say, what am I taking for granted? And that's a common one. I've put millions of dollars into the system. It's got to work because I put millions of dollars into it. Is that true?
Yeah.
There's no guarantee.
So how do you think we combat that as change management professionals and those of us that are more in consultative roles with these project teams? I get it. Somebody's got their neck out over the guillotine saying, yep, hey, they went to the CFO and got funding for this project, and they don't want to have egg on their face. But I just, for some reason, I don't understand why that seems more difficult to go and tell others in the organization, listen, we're going to put this thing in the back burner for 90 days because we've got to go get this adoption problem solved. We have some user experience issues that are causing bad results, and we think it's bad to move forward right now. Why that seems to be a worse option than actually cramming this thing down people's throat who don't like it, aren't prepared for it, aren't going to adopt it, and ultimately it will be less successful than it could otherwise be. But that timeline becomes a bigger priority. It's like, let's do it fast and shitty. That's okay. But 90 days late and really good never seems to be the option. That doesn't make sense to me.
Or let's flip it and say, let's just fail faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do that all the time. Let's face it. We've all been part of some implementation that you went, man, if we had just called it a year ago, we all knew this was coming. We thought, truthfully, I don't think this is going to work. And let's talk about why. And let's say maybe that's good feedback midstream that it will make it successful. But if you don't have some point where milestones throughout that project, and I think you normally have implementation milestones where you reassess this, but you got to be brutally honest. And I think back to my Navy days, every post flight, it was, take your ego off. Let's talk about what you did well and what you didn't do well. And then we get back to work. Hey, that's a learning opportunity. You got to do that with every implementation too. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And is that failure criteria? Because if it is, we need to put a bullet in this thing and move on to the next project.
Any ideas on how we can all do a better job. Going back to what we talked about before with usage versus adoption, and those are not your words, but you seem to be nodding your head in agreement that there's a
Yeah, absolutely.
distinction between those two states, whatever we call them. Any ideas on how we can all do a better job of measuring adoption and setting that up as an objective earlier? You've talked about this since we first came on today about setting the expectations early in the process, and I think that's missing. I think we often say, hey, we need to get 80 or 90% of the people logged in by such and such a date, but that's not really an adoption metric.
Right.
Any ideas on how we can measure that better?
Well, did you go into the implementation with some KPI, some productivity or performance bump, some value statement that, hey, I'm going to save some money? If you're not saving the money or you're not hitting that KPI, you might have an adoption issue. I got everybody these smartphones and they use them just to make phone calls. Well, okay, then what do they have smartphones for? There's a host of apps and there's all sorts of other capability there that you could use for all sorts of other productivity uses. I just use that as an example, but why would you buy a smartphone if you just had to make calls?
Yeah. I talked to an Apple guy a couple of weeks back that supports field service customers for Apple. And it was a really insightful conversation because, we all think of Apple, not everybody. I think a lot of us think of Apple. I'm a big Apple fan. So I think of Apple as an easy user experience.
Yeah.
And, they think a lot about intuitive design and just the overall user experience of their devices and platforms. Yet, what's interesting is that this gentleman offered up a different perspective, that they are innovating at such a rapid pace. They're bringing so many new capabilities to the device. Yeah, make a phone call, it's still pretty much the same thing. Send an email, pretty much the same thing. But an example that he gave is that he was out in the field with a field service technician, and the tech was frustrated because he was using gloves and he was expected to type like his trip notes for a field service call.
Right.
And he was getting frustrated. And of course, he says, "Oh, this phone's a piece of crap. This app's a piece of crap. Everything's a piece of crap, and you can't use this thing." And the guy from Apple's like, "We've done a lot of advancements on voice dictation. You can go into that field. You can just
nobody knows how to use it.
And nobody knows how to use that." And I was like, man, that is such a good freaking example. And I love this guy because he is close to field service technicians. So he's kind of dealing with this, deskless frontline workforce and bringing it into technology that we often associate with kind of knowledge workers, iOS and Macs and stuff like that. But he's saying, no, like, even though Apple's intuitive and it's easy to use, some people don't always connect the dots on their own. And we have an obligation. He's saying they at Apple, but I'm saying we collectively, all of us that are responsible for implementing technologies like this, to look for those little valleys where, it's the gap between success and failure in that spot is actually not very far. So he described this story to me, and this guy's got like this epiphany moment saying, holy crap, this is a completely different experience for me. Now I can get my job done. And of course, all the people downstream, like, oh my God, these guys are actually filling out the text fields in the work order the way they're supposed to.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's what we wanted all along.
And the gap between that was such a real simple thing, but it just took a little bit of thinking. In his case, he went out to go do a ride along with the tech to go see firsthand what the problems were. And the gap is actually so freaking narrow. And so to me, that's an example of, was he using the app? Yes. Was he adopting it, using it successfully? Not even close. So yeah, he was signing in. If our KPI was user logins, if we were looking at user logins, we'd have had 100% in that case, right? But that's not telling the full story. And so I'm sure there are 100 more examples.
Oh, and you've got lost productivity because this guy's got to take off his work gloves, and let's face it, if it's a contamination issue, he's got to use extra product and he's got to take time to type this thing in. It's a pain. But as another example, I live in an area where you don't have good cell coverage. So I have servicemen come out and they want to service something. And they go, "Oh, I don't have a connection. Can I hook up to your Wi-Fi?" I'm like, wait a minute. How come all that stuff isn't saved on your hard drive somewhere? Why isn't it locally accessible?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the tech guy didn't think about that. Oh, so you require a cellular connection to do your job? wow, okay, somebody wasn't thinking. How many times do you see that? And I would say that's probably true in a lot of places in the US and globally.
It is.
If you're relying on a cellular connection, you don't have a local backup,
Yeah.
you are putting your frontline workers in a bad spot. Now, I guarantee almost everybody listening to this podcast has seen some example of that.
I've been on some ride-alongs with techs, and every single time that I've been
Yep.
out there, connectivity is an issue. I was in one ride-along with a field service tech calling on a hospital. Hospitals are notorious for having bad cellular coverage.
Yeah.
You know,
But we're cloud enabled. We're
yes,
cloud forward, man. This is the way of the future, as long as you got a connection.
yeah, but there were a lot of restrictions on their ability to use their technology as a result of that. So you're spot on. So let's get back to thinking about communication, and maybe I really want to draw on more of these examples. I'm kind of fascinated with this idea of the battle space is always flexing and just always changing, and how maybe you're taking those ideas into your role as a change management professional to say, how can we build that culture within a program or within a team and in an organization to think more like the organization, the culture of the Navy in your case. Is there any ideas that you can share with us on that?
Well, the best example I'd have from my time in the service is the value of the non-commissioned officer. The most of what we get done is on the backs of very young men and women who are non-commissioned officers. Usually your sergeants, your petty officers. You've got the same thing in every company. They're called line managers.
Mm-hmm.
They've got the line workforce that works for them, and they're doing these, let's say, staff updates, line updates once a week or every day for 15 minutes before the shift. And they have accountability for everybody that's working for them. As an officer, I had to make sure they were successful. I wanted to make sure they were successful because the back of everything we were doing was on their backs. That's the same for your line managers. They're accountable, but have you done everything you can to make sure that they're not only being able to enable their folks, but also accelerate processes, make their jobs easier? How many line managers do you have that just are burning themselves out, doing administrivia for their workers and trying to get the job done? How do I make that better so that they can serve the people that work for them better? That's usually what I'm looking for when I'm talking about change management. It's enabling those folks.
So I love the way you're thinking about that, and this has come up a lot on the podcast lately. In fact, this is probably one of the most I don't know, often talked about topics lately, about the importance of that frontline leadership and how I think overlooked they are as an integral component for success in the organization. And so I'm curious, any ideas that come to your mind about how we can be better at serving them so that they can serve the people that work for them and ensure that success? I'm just wondering if you have any project examples or just ideas that come to your mind. You don't have to give me any proper
Oh
names.
yeah, no. I've got a lot of experience with this, and I love it when leadership does skip levels and things like that in focus groups. I talk about this all the time, and the data people hate me on this one, but it's the power of the anecdote. Anecdotal data is data, okay, and sometimes it's critical data, because one frontline leader that tells you, hey, this just isn't working. If we only did this, I could really deliver for the company. And then you hear it again, and maybe you hear it once more. Well, it's only 3 data points, but maybe those 3 data points over those 3 leaders are overseeing 50, 60 folks that are being impacted by that in the delivery of your services. And that's less productive for some reason. Well, you've only got 3 data points, but you got enough to know that's affecting 60 other data points. So now I've got something that may be something I want to spend some time on fixing. And I think going back to those leaders and going, hey, I don't need to know how you're doing your job. I need to know how I can help you do your job better. If you were king for a day, and this is the question I love most, king for a day, and you could change anything about the company, what would you change? And 9 times out of 10, they're not thinking about the company. They're thinking about themselves. And like we all do, how can I do my job easier so I can get it done? I'm proud of my work, but I'm hamstrung from whatever, process that's slowing me down. Asking those top 2 or 3 things helps you to start figuring out where you need to either adjust a process, adopt the technology to make a process easier, or pull some new process out that says, hey, it actually worked better when we did it the old way. That's a really hard one to do, though.
Yeah. So that's an example though of where maybe you saw, when you said earlier, you see some signs along the project that this thing's going to fail. If that's what your people are saying in the early phases of something, that's an indication that, you can keep jamming this thing down their throat.
Square peg, round hole. Sorry, this one ain't gonna fit.
Yeah. So any thoughts on how to make that case up to the project sponsors? I think that's actually something that many of the people that I talk to, both on and off the podcast, maybe aren't quite sure how to package up that type of information, right? So you, in the story that you shared, the hypothetical example, you were out talking to Jimmy, and Jimmy shares a story and says, hey, this thing's just not going to fly out here. How do you package that up in a way that's meaningful, that convinces those project champions and the key stakeholders that maybe funded this thing to say, like, guys, we've got to put the brakes on this thing, and here's why. Talk to Jimmy. Because even as I'm asking you this question, I'm like, yeah, that sounds not very compelling.
Oh, no, it's absolutely compelling. I'll tell you why. Because when you entered into this project, you came out with some sort of business value KPI. Let's say I'm going to save $1 million by implementing this process. At least that's my idea. I think it might save us $1 million. Project sponsors like, I'm going to give myself a pat on the back because we're going to implement this and I'm going to spend a bunch of money, but I'm going to save us $1 million every year. You go down to the frontline worker and find out, well, there's actually a cost to this, implementing this, and it's lost productivity, let's say. And I go, hey, well, how much time are you spending on this when you could be servicing, another customer? Oh, well, it's an hour here or 2 hours there or something like that. You start taking that data across all of your employees. What's the cost in service delivery?
Yeah.
Is it $2 million? So I'm saving $1 million in order to spend an extra 2. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. That's a quick way to draw a line between what my initial implementation KPIs were and what the perceived impact is at implementation. This is something that I can't tell you happens often enough, is you're not measuring the impact. You have to measure impact, because you're never going to be able to draw this back to your original KPIs. And if you're measuring it properly, you can say, hey, I'm not even online to get to that KPI. If you want to adjust and say, oh, we're not going to save $1 million, maybe we'll save $500,000. Okay, that's fine. As long as we all agree that's what we want to do. But if it's, oh, no, we're going to wind up spending $2 million instead. No, we're not anywhere close to what we thought we were going to get. That comes from measuring the impact over the implementation.
What ideas can you share with us about how to measure better? Because I agree, everything that you just said makes perfect sense. And we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast. I think something that our audience and I are still struggling with is how to do a better job of measuring it. It seems like every time I ask this question, we come around to some kind of like fuzzy math kind of answer, where it's hard to measure the data. And I'm just curious if you have any ideas on how we can be better at that.
Well, I usually bring it back to cycle time. Whether it's making widgets or delivering services, you all have cycle times. Everybody has them, and we all measure to them. Well, what was my cycle time before this change? What is it after? Am I making more widgets or fewer? Am I able to service more customers or fewer because of this change? Because if it's not doing that, you're not delivering value to the business. Right. We don't implement change because we just want to change things. We do it because the marketplace demands it. And the marketplace demands it because you're going to lose money if you don't. You're not going to be able to stay in business if you don't. Well, that's not true for every business. So if you're implementing something, you need to be extra sensitive to measuring its impact on what you are trying to deliver. And that's usually tied to cycle time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. I think a lot of times people want to default back to looking at the cost as some line item. And the problem with that is the impact may result in the same number of technicians, same number of delivery drivers, same number of retail associates, whatever the case may be. And so the line item of cost actually doesn't change.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of times the argument kind of falls apart because it's like, well, our cost is going to be the same. We have 250 techs now. We're going to have 250 techs after. We had 250 techs before. So the cost actually doesn't change. But what you're describing, and I think this is a really good way to think about it, is really more on the output side. What are we getting for that cost? And that's where the cost really is, the impact to this. If we were successful, those 250 techs should be able to go from 2,500 calls a day to 2,600 calls a day.
Right.
And instead, after this implementation, we're at 2,350 calls a day.
Or I'm still net zero and my retention's gone way up because my employees are happier.
Right.
That sometimes that's the right answer too.
Especially right now when everybody's short headcount.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, every team that we talk to is dealing with turnover issues and they're down. They've got open job recs that they can't fill and stuff like that.
Absolutely. That's all over the place right now.
Yeah.
But that's where I say, it's not always, hey, I'm going to make money or save money. Sometimes it is just net zero, but there's other measurements. All of your HR professionals out there are going to say retention's a big deal because it does cost you money. You don't necessarily see it right away, but it does cost you.
Yeah. And this is, I get frustrated and I don't always feel like I do a good job of articulating my frustration, and not that anybody should ever care about why I'm frustrated, but I just feel like in many of the large organizations that I am fortunate enough to interact with, they really struggle to put some real numbers around these things. Everybody complains about retention. They complain about the open recs. But then when you really start wanting to talk about the solutions to those problems, then it's like, oh, we don't have budget for this. We don't have budget for that. And, and I actually think change management is one of those great examples. And I don't sell change management services, and I'm not a change management professional, but I think a lot of organizations, they look at change management as if it's some like kind of warm and fuzzy, like, oh, that's only something that we can do when times are good, and times aren't good.
That's right.
If
times are good, you don't need a change manager.
Yes, exactly. It's the exact wrong way to look at that, right?
That's right.
And so it just seems like because of, I don't know, it seems like there's a lack of attention to tracking those metrics. What does retention really cost the business? What do these open headcounts really cost the business? What's the cost of crappy customer experience right now? Because your techs are running 12 hours a day, or your delivery drivers are working overtime, and things are slipping through the cracks, right? There is a cost to that.
Yeah.
And I admit it's very easy to talk about it here in a podcast, and it's a lot harder to actually measure.
That's right. In the real world, it gets a little bit more difficult.
I respect and totally understand that. But I also think that it just feels to me like organizations aren't working hard enough to measure that. I don't know. Maybe somebody's going to send me some hate.
No, and I wouldn't say they're not working hard enough, because I'd say we all work hard. We all work hard at what we do. The issue is, are we working
to say that?
Are we working hard on the right things?
Yeah.
And this goes back to prioritization. I often say every organization struggles with two big things: prioritizing and holding people accountable. Well, leadership should be prioritizing things and then holding others accountable. But often the priorities change, and then we don't communicate that to anybody. So how am I supposed to hold them accountable? Or I have a priority that I've just taken off, or I'm not measuring to. Well, I can't hold you accountable there too. So there's a lot of other elements underneath those, but you've got to set your priorities. If the priority is retention, okay, cool. Let's make that absolutely clear, and let's focus most of our efforts there. But how many organizations go, I have 12 priorities, and I'm gonna put my budget to all of this. Oh, come on, nonsense. You don't have 12 priorities. You probably have 2 or 3, because you're a human being just like the rest of us. You can't get your brain around 12 things all day long.
Right. I used to work for somebody that said, we need to be laser focused on these 6 things. And I always used to think to myself, I don't think I've ever seen a laser, because it's
it focuses on one thing at a time.
So just to switch the analogy or limit it to one, but you.
Well, but then you go back to, okay, how do you work? How do you fly a plane? You maintain a scan. If I only look out the windscreen, I only see what's out in front of me. I don't check my airspeed or my oil pressure, where my engines are set. That, all those things, you've got to maintain a scan. That's how you maintain multiple priorities. It doesn't mean you're laser focused on anything, because laser focus gets you killed. You look at you maintain your scan, and that's how you manage priorities, and you hold yourself or those around you accountable for the things that are in your scan. But if it's not in your scan, you sure aren't measuring it, which means you're not holding anybody accountable, which means it ain't getting done.
All right. I love it. I can't believe it took 30 something minutes for you to bring in something from flying into the conversation.
Well, I loved it, because I'd say I laugh with my wife. I've got the attention span of a gnat, but I like to make sure I maintain a scan about all the different things that I've got to prioritize.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. We got to wrap it up. We're already running out of time here. Is there any last advice? What would you tell the folks that are out there listening to us right now? What's one piece of wisdom that you'd share with them about the most effective way to help an organization see the need for agility and make change part of their normal culture?
I'd say simplify. If you're not simplifying, what's the alternative? You make things harder. How can I make things simpler for myself, simpler for my employees, more simple for my customers? Yeah. Because if you're going that way, you probably trek it in the right direction.
I love that. I think that is a fantastic way for us to close out. And man, Sean, I really appreciate the time today. This has been a really good discussion. I knew it would be. And I actually didn't even get to some of the topics that I was hoping to get with you. So we might have to have another call at some point.
Sounds great.
But for our audience, we're going to wrap it up there. I hope the audience, you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. And we really appreciate our listeners for your continued engagement with the podcast. Unless this is your first episode listening to Frontline Innovators, you probably already know that this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the only end-to-end systems training platform that's optimized for frontline operations. You can learn more about how you can solve your frontline systems training challenges by visiting skillful.com, and that's SKYLLFUL.com. We spell that at the end of the podcast because it's spelled uniquely with a Y, SKYLLFUL.com. So it's not Skyful, it's Skillful, because we're helping develop the digital skills of the frontline workforce. So thank you, everybody. Look forward to you coming on the next call. And Sean, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Justin.